Down in Harmony Creek, John thought he could buy peace by choosing the safe harbor of Miss Clara. But the minute he turned his back on the restless spirit of river girl Lila, fate stepped in with a terrible, swift hand. The fire that consumed her cottage became the very foundation of his respectable life, cloaking his marriage in endless, silent regret. He became a prosperous man, yet carried the weight of a coffin that was never meant to be. Listen close, because this is the tale of a man who built a kingdom on a secret lie, spending every single day wishing he'd had the courage to lose everything. The problem with John was never his character. It was his geography. He lived in Harmony Creek, a place where people measured a man by the size of his porch and the quietness of his wife. John stood exactly at the fork in the road, with two women pulling him in opposite directions. The first was Clara. Clara was the town's golden girl, the scent of lavender and the promise of a life laid out straight and true, like a freshly paved road. Marrying Clara meant inheriting respectability, securing his family's hardware store, and never having to worry about what the ladies at the church bake sale were whispering. Her love was a sturdy anchor, built for bad weather. Everyone, from his mother to the bank teller, believed John was destined for Clara. And John, being a man raised on duty, often mistook that widespread expectation for the true calling of his own heart. He was 30 years old, and he knew that by sundown, he had to make the choice that would define whether he lived a comfortable lie or a magnificent, terrifying truth. The humid air felt heavy with his fate, and the very ground beneath his sensible shoes seemed to tremble with the weight of the decision he could no longer postpone. The second woman was Lila. Lila was the opposite of the town itself. She lived right where the creek turned into the muddy river, and her cottage was barely standing, leaning into the weeping willows. She was a seamstress, but everyone knew her real trade was trouble, beauty, and restlessness. Her hair was dark as wet earth, and her eyes held a feverish, knowing light that saw right through John's respectable facade. When he was with Clara, he saw the future. When he was with Lila, he saw the present, sharp and demanding. Lila didn't talk about mortgages or social standing. She talked about leaving Harmony Creek and heading somewhere wild where the wind didn't carry gossip. She offered him a life of glorious uncertainty, full of art, passion, and likely poverty. This was the life John's soul craved, but the sensible man he had become was terrified of it. Lila's love was a flame, bright and consuming, and John knew that if he touched it, he would be changed forever, maybe burned to ash, but at least, finally, real. The pressure came from every corner, but mostly from Mr. Hayes, Clara's father. Mr. Hayes, the lawyer, invited John for expensive bourbon and quiet, deadly conversations. A good wife, Mr. Hayes would purr, polishing his glass, is a silent partner, John. Clara will elevate your status. That river girl, she'll sink you. Harmony Creek forgives mistakes, but it never forgets disgrace. Think about the legacy you want to leave. Do you want to be remembered as the man who brought the hardware store into the future, or the fool who ran away with the river witch? The word disgrace hit John hard. It was the Southern curse, the thing that could unravel a family's name for generations. He realized that choosing Lila meant not just losing a lifestyle, but intentionally accepting the scorn of every person he had grown up trying to impress. The weight of his community's judgment pressed down on him like a physical hand, a phantom shackle that was impossible to shake off. He knew that the only thing separating him from a life of freedom was his own crushing fear of being seen as less than respectable. John spent the next week in a haze, unable to focus on orders at the store, haunted by two visions. In the first, he was standing next to Clara at the altar, surrounded by smiling, relieved faces, his life a steady line stretching toward a prosperous horizon. He felt safe but cold. In the second, He was on a train with Lila, rattling away from Harmony Creek, looking back at the town shrinking into a tiny, insignificant smudge. He felt wild, alive, but utterly exposed. The final decision came one muggy evening when he saw a small boy outside Lila's cottage, laughing as he skipped a stone across the water. The boy looked poor but free. John's heart seized up. He thought of having children with Lila, children who would inherit her beautiful recklessness, but who would also face the world's disdain because of the choices of their parents. He realized he didn't just fear poverty for himself. He feared it for the innocent ones. This fear, the paternal, protective instinct for the children he didn't even have yet, was the final, devastating weight that tipped the scales. He chose the safe foundation, the life that could weather the storms, even if it meant sacrificing the sun. He drove to Clara's house that night. The house was enormous, white, and silent, a fortress of stability. He stood in the parlor, surrounded by polished mahogany and the faint scent of beeswax. He told Clara, his voice trembling only slightly, that he wanted to marry her, soon. Clara didn't scream or cry. She just walked to him and laid her head on his chest. "I knew you were smart, John," she whispered. Her relief was so profound, so pure, that a new, different kind of guilt settled into his heart. The guilt of betraying such honest, simple devotion. He had condemned her to a half-hearted marriage, built on his compromise. He stayed with her until midnight, talking about their wedding plans and the house they would renovate. When he left, he was exhausted, but the agonizing war inside him was finally over. He was a defeated soldier, but at least he was standing on safe ground. He drove home, trying to convince himself that peace was superior to passion. The next morning, he had to tell Lila. He knew she wouldn't make a scene. She had too much pride for that. He drove back to the river, the rising sun struggling to pierce the thick mist. He found her on the porch, not stitching this time, but simply watching the current. She wore the look of a person who had already accepted the ending. John stood there, his new, heavy certainty making it impossible to breathe. "I'm sorry, Lila," he managed to choke out. "I can't be the man you need. I'm marrying Clara." Lila slowly turned her head, and in her dark eyes, John saw not anger, but a deep, withering pity. "You chose the town, John, not me. You chose their whisper over your own voice." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a whimsical thing she'd made just last week. "Take this," she said, her voice dry as fallen leaves. "It's a reminder that you had wings, but you clipped them yourself." She placed it in his hand. The smooth, cool wood a devastating contrast to the heavy gold of Clara's locket in his other pocket. She then turned and walked into the cottage, pulling the door shut with a soft, final click. John stood there, holding the wooden bird, listening to the silence, which felt louder than any gunshot. The wedding to Clara was muted, cloaked in the shadow of the recent tragedy. John went through the motions, a handsome, hollow figure. He and Clara moved into the big house, the silence within its thick walls amplifying his guilt. He was a good husband, dutiful and kind, but the fire had taken the joy out of him, leaving only an exhausted compliance. Clara, sensing his distance, grew quiet and fiercely devoted to propriety, seeing it as the only thing that could save their marriage. She never mentioned Lila, but John caught her looking at him sometimes, a flicker of suspicion in her calm blue eyes, as if she knew his heart was buried somewhere near the river. Their marriage became a silent, beautiful agreement. She would offer him stability, and he would offer her a good name, but neither would ever seek true warmth from the other. He kept the small wooden bird hidden in his safe, a secret, painful relic of the life that might have been. A year later, their son, Will, was born. Will was a miracle of squalling, demanding life, and for a short while, John felt a surge of genuine, unadulterated love. This new love, focused entirely on his son, provided a temporary truce in the war against himself. John threw himself into fatherhood, believing that if he could just make Will's life perfect, secure, and respectable, he could somehow justify the price he had paid. Will grew up to be steady, grounded, and utterly practical, inheriting his mother's calm nature. John loved him fiercely, but sometimes, looking into Will's contented eyes, John felt a wrenching sadness. His son had none of the reckless fire, none of the vibrant chaos that Lila had embodied. He realized that his choice had neutered his family line, ensuring that the next generation would also be safe, and therefore tragically incomplete. Years folded into decades. John ran the hardware store, became a pillar of the community, and watched his son go to college. His life was exactly what Mr. Hayes had promised. Successful, admired, and utterly without risk. But the stability that he had craved became a prison. He and Clara lived separate, polite lives under the same roof. The house was immaculate, the garden flawless, but the silence between them was enormous. John began to take long walks toward the river every Sunday afternoon, a habit Clara never questioned. He didn't go to the site of the fire, but to the small, unkempt patch of ground at the edge of the cemetery, where Lila's simple, unmarked grave lay. He never wept. He just stood there, letting the heavy, humid air remind him of the day he had traded passion for duty. One rainy spring, a letter arrived, addressed to John but forwarded from Lila's distant cousin, who had been cleaning up old family papers. It was a single sheet, sealed and brittle. The cousin wrote that there had been a long-forgotten, small insurance policy on the cottage. More importantly, the cousin revealed that Lila had left a note with her, dated the day before the fire. The note explained that Lila was selling everything and moving west to pursue her art, leaving Harmony Creek forever. She was planning to leave town that very morning, taking only what she could carry. The cousin admitted they always suspected Lila had left, wanting the town to believe she was gone forever rather than having them chase or pity her. The letter ended, "We never reported the note, John. It was better for everyone this way." John read the letter in his study, the rain outside mimicking the storm inside his chest. Lila hadn't been in the cottage. She hadn't died. She had chosen freedom, even faking her death, and had run west while he was marrying Clara. The crushing realization hit him. He had spent 20 years mourning a ghost, grieving a tragedy that was entirely self-inflicted. He had not sealed her grave. He had sealed his own. Lila was alive and free somewhere, living the vibrant, risky life he had been too afraid to choose. The beautiful, terrible finality of the fire was a lie, and the certainty of his regret suddenly became infinite. He could have gone after her, could have searched for her, but instead, he had chosen the comforting illusion of her demise. He immediately threw the letter into the fireplace, watching the fragile paper curl and burn, determined to bury this terrifying truth alongside the memory of the fire. The knowledge was a poison that seeped into every minute of John's life. He couldn't look at Clara without seeing the massive, beautiful lie he was living. He couldn't look at Will without seeing the predictable, safe future he had chosen for him. The shame of his choice was replaced by the horror of his cowardice. He started walking to the river every day, sometimes standing right at the edge, wondering if he could still catch the current. John became obsessed with the West, buying maps and books, tracing lines across the country, trying to imagine where Lila might be. He never booked a ticket. He never dared to search. The thought of seeing her again, free, vibrant, and utterly unchanged by his rejection, was more terrifying than the thought of her death. He feared the pity in her eyes, the confirmation that he was, indeed, the weak man who had chosen the tidy center. His failure was not just a mistake. It was the foundation of his entire life. The great irony was that the stability he chose required him to live a life of constant, grinding internal turmoil, while Lila had achieved true peace by embracing chaos. Clara passed away gently one quiet spring morning. It was a long, slow illness that mirrored the slow death of their intimacy. John was a good, constant caretaker, performing his duties flawlessly. When she died, he felt a sudden, massive relief, quickly followed by a profound, agonizing guilt. He had mourned the wrong woman for 20 years. He had given Clara only duty, and he felt a searing remorse for wasting her pure, honest devotion. He buried her in the grand family plot, under an enormous, polished granite monument, a final, public statement of his immense respect and his emotional distance. As the coffin was lowered, John looked past the headstones, toward the distant, unmarked patch of earth near the willows, a silent tear finally tracing a path down his weathered cheek. A tear for both women, for the life he lived, and the life he failed to claim. John lived out his final years in the empty, silent house. He was frail, his sensible shoes worn thin. His son, Will, visited regularly, bringing his own wife and children, a picture of perfect, successful domesticity. John would watch them, smiling vaguely, recognizing the profound emptiness that lay beneath their comfortable routine. He knew his legacy was not the hardware store's success, but the spreading of his own cowardice, the insistence on safety over passion. He spent his days sitting on the porch swing, the rhythmic creak a metronome marking the time he had wasted. He was the most respected man in Harmony Creek, and the most miserable. He kept the small, carved wooden bird in his hand until the very end, its smooth, cool wood a permanent connection to the fire he never faced. He died in his sleep, his hand clenched around the tiny relic,